Judge fines Jasmine Crockett $500 for wearing a cross, then gets shocked by her legal mastery. The late afternoon sun poured a golden blaze over Washington, D.C., casting long shadows across the Capitol skyline. Inside a modern apartment just blocks from the White House, Jasmine Crockett, calm, composed, and the youngest press secretary in American history, rested for a rare moment of peace. Her apartment was minimalist but powerful. Crystal clear windows, polished hardwood floors, not a single item out of place. On her navy blazer, a small silver cross gleamed subtly, elegant, personal, defiant. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a belief she carried like armor. Then her phone rang. The caller ID read only one name: President Donald J. Trump. She answered without hesitation. "Jasmine," came the commanding voice, "there's a situation. A group of Christians is suing the city for banning public prayer. D.C. local court, I want you there. Sit, observe, and report directly to me. Now!" The line went dead. No time for questions. Jasmine stood up, tension crackling in the air. She grabbed her bag, snapped on her heels, and buttoned her blazer, the cross on her collar steady and bold. In the elevator, her reflection stared back, calm but battle-ready. She'd faced reporters, defended policies, but this was different. This was personal. Today, she wasn't just a press secretary. She was a Black woman walking into a courtroom with her faith on display. The D.C. local court was a furnace of tension wrapped in marble and bureaucracy. The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped through the glass doors, she was hit by a wall of noise and movement. Low murmurs from anxious defendants, the rustling of papers, the mechanical tapping of courtroom clerks typing endless streams of citations. The air was heavy, not with heat, but with nerves. It smelled faintly of old wood, cheap coffee, and anticipation. Benches lined with people from every walk of life were packed shoulder to shoulder, waiting to be called for everything from unpaid parking tickets to minor lease disputes. A teenage boy in ripped jeans argued with his father under his breath. Two women in colorful faux fur jackets shared gum while flipping through documents, one of them wearing a necklace the size of a small chandelier. A man slouched in the front row wearing a tattered t-shirt printed in bold red letters, "I am the law." It was ironic, loud, almost confrontational. No one batted an eye. The court clerk barely looked up. The bailiff didn't move. Jasmine paused for a beat, scanning the room like a field operative taking in enemy terrain. Her every instinct sharpened. The courtroom wasn't large, but the chaos compressed it, making the space feel smaller, tighter, claustrophobic. She found a spot in the middle row and sat, back straight, phone in hand, ready to take notes. The cross on her collar caught the courtroom lights and glimmered faintly. She noticed a few glances, subtle, lingering, but shrugged them off. She wasn't here to stand out. She was here to observe, and yet something gnawed at her gut. There was a strange stillness beneath the noise, like a breath being held just a second too long. Something unspoken but unmistakably hostile. The door behind the judge's bench swung open with a groan that silenced even the whispers. Every eye turned. Judge Charles Hargrove entered like a storm contained in human form. 62 years of authority clung to his steps like armor. His robe was jet black, stiff, perfectly pressed, so pristine it almost gleamed. His gait was rigid, calculated, like he moved on rails forged from old-world power. His hair was gray at the temples, combed back so tightly it looked painful. Wire-rimmed glasses sat on the bridge of his nose, their frames thin and cold like surgical instruments. But it was his eyes, flat, gray, unforgiving, that gave away the truth. Hargrove didn't see individuals. He saw disruptions. He saw threats. He saw control slipping any time someone challenged his order. He didn't speak at first. He simply scanned the room, his gaze a scalpel carving through every face in the crowd. He lingered on no one for more than a second, until he reached Jasmine. His eyes froze, just for a moment, long enough for her to feel it. Then, like a machine rebooting, he looked away and sat down at the bench, his black robe folding around him like smoke. "All rise," barked the bailiff, but the command felt more like a warning. Jasmine rose with the others, composed but alert. She'd studied Hargrove in news reports before. infamous for his rigid courtroom control, notorious for controversial rulings, and deeply feared for his unpredictable temperament. But nothing in the headlines had prepared her for the way the room shifted under his presence. It was like oxygen thinned, and everyone knew order wouldn't just be maintained, it would be enforced. As people began sitting again, Jasmine glanced around. The man in the slogan t-shirt hadn't moved an inch. The woman in the gaudy necklace was now sipping a drink from a cup she'd smuggled in. Not a word of reprimand. Judge Hargrove dealt with each case like clockwork, cold, fast, mechanical. But then his eyes shifted. They stopped mid-scan, froze, and locked onto her. Not her face, not her press badge, but her cross, that small silver emblem on her collar. Silent, still, and shining under the flickering courtroom lights, became the center of his focus, as if it were a weapon she had smuggled in. The change was instant. Hargrove's brow tightened. His fingers, once lazily tapping the gavel, curled into a fist. Something had triggered him, and it wasn't noise or disrespect. It was belief. Jasmine caught it. She saw how long he stared, how his gaze flicked from the cross to her eyes with thinly veiled contempt. She shifted slightly in her seat, not out of discomfort, but to let the light catch the cross again, on purpose. She wanted to be sure. And yes, he flinched. It wasn't fashion he objected to. He had ignored the woman with the blinding necklace and the man with the vulgar t-shirt. This wasn't about decorum. It was about faith, specifically her faith. In a room where chaos wore sequins and slogans, Jasmine's silent cross was the only thing that disturbed the order. Judge Hargrove's gavel slammed down with the weight of thunder, loud, final, and laced with personal contempt. It was more than a call to order. It was an announcement, a shot fired across the room. His eyes, glinting with something colder than mere discipline, locked onto Jasmine Crockett like a predator identifying its prey. "Miss Crockett," he said, his voice low but sharp as broken glass, "you will remove that cross from your attire. Now!" His words didn't echo with legal authority. They rang with disdain, like a man spitting out a taste he found offensive. Gasps rose from the gallery, a dozen heads turning toward Jasmine. But she remained motionless, calm. Her hands rested in her lap, her back straight, her chin slightly raised. Not in arrogance, but in unshakable dignity. The silver cross nestled on the collar of her blazer was not glowing or flashing. It simply was, quiet, subtle, unyielding. And in that stillness, it screamed louder than anything else in the courtroom. Jasmine stood slowly, every movement deliberate, as if declaring with her posture alone that she would not be moved by fear. Her voice, when it came, was calm and unwavering, measured with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she stood on. "Your Honor," she said, her words carrying not just into the room, but into the record. "This cross is not a performance. It is not a statement of protest. It is a personal item, protected under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. My presence here is in no way disruptive. I am observing these proceedings on official assignment. My attire is professional. My behavior, respectful." She paused just long enough for the words First Amendment to hang in the air, like a verdict already rendered. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had law on her side. But Hargrove didn't flinch. He only leaned forward, narrowing his eyes like a man baited into a fight he didn't expect, but couldn't resist. His next words came out like poison. "This is a courtroom, not a church, Miss Crockett. My courtroom. And in my courtroom, we don't parade religious symbols like trophies." A tremor passed through the room. The woman in the sequined jacket visibly tensed. The man in the slogan shirt stopped chewing gum. Even the court reporter looked up, her fingers hovering, uncertain whether to keep typing or just listen. Jasmine stared at him, her expression unchanged. But inside something burned, not from offense, but from recognition. This wasn't about procedure. It was about power. And more importantly, about where that power drew the line. Her cross had crossed it. The gavel slammed again, violently this time. The sharp echo bounced off the walls, startling more than just the spectators. "You are in contempt of this court," Hargrove barked. $500, effective immediately. Pay it or be escorted out. The words dropped like a bomb. Audible gasps filled the room. Whispers rippled through the benches like wind through dry grass. She didn't even speak, someone muttered. He's serious? Said another. A woman leaned toward her lawyer and whispered, he's letting that guy wear a shirt that mocks the law, and she's fine for a cross? Eyes darted back and forth between Jasmine and the judge, disbelief blooming in every corner of the room. But Hargrove was unmoved. The fine wasn't about disturbance. It wasn't about rules. It was about her, who she was, what she wore, and what she quietly represented. Jasmine stood her ground, her eyes never leaving his. Understood, she said, her voice even, though behind it, a storm was brewing. Her posture didn't shrink. It sharpened. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. She absorbed the injustice like a blade she intended to return later. And the crowd saw it. They saw the quiet composure in her stance, the way she didn't crumble under the weight of targeted humiliation. Some began to shift in their seats, uncomfortable now, not with her, but with him. Something unspoken began to form in the air. This wasn't a courtroom maintaining order. This was a man with a gavel punishing belief. Even the court staff couldn't hide their unease. The clerk, Mrs. Thompson, blinked twice before resuming her typing, her fingers noticeably slower than before. The bailiff, James Wilson, a man of discipline and few words, glanced from the judge to Jasmine with something almost like pity in his eyes. He'd seen dozens of contempt fines over the years, but none quite like this. None quite so personal. Jasmine didn't look at him. She didn't need allies. Not yet. She just needed the moment to pass, to burn itself into memory, into evidence. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a woman with a cross. She was a woman with a purpose. And this courtroom, this fine, this act of injustice, it had just turned her purpose into a mission. A slow, calculated silence gripped the courtroom after the fine was issued. But Jasmine Crockett remained still, unshaken. Her eyes never left Judge Hargrove's, though the tension between them could have been cut with a knife. The murmurs were still floating across the room like uneasy ghosts, but Jasmine had stopped listening. Something shifted in her demeanor, not fear, not defeat, but precision. She reached into her document bag with deliberate grace, pulled out a sleek leather folio, and unzipped it. The crowd leaned in unconsciously. From within, she retrieved a gold-trimmed card, small but unmistakable, and held it high enough for the room and Hargrove to see. It shimmered under the courtroom's pale fluorescent light like a badge of war. My name is Jasmine Crockett, she said, voice sharp and focused. I am the White House press secretary under President Donald J. Trump. The room collectively inhaled, even the bailiff's posture shifted. And I have been assigned to this courtroom on direct presidential order to observe this religious freedom case, she added, her voice steady, almost surgical. For a moment, Judge Hargrove didn't react. He blinked once. His hand, still gripping the gavel, loosened slightly. He hadn't expected that. Not from her. Not from the woman he tried to shame into silence. This cross, Jasmine continued, tapping lightly on the silver emblem pinned to her blazer, is not a statement of rebellion. It is a personal symbol of faith. It is protected speech under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and her thumb subtly tapped the screen of her phone. I have recorded this entire exchange, from the moment you first addressed me. The weight of that sentence dropped like a sledgehammer. The gallery was dead silent. The sound of the HVAC system was suddenly loud. The clack of a single key from the court clerk sounded like a gunshot. Hargrove's jaw twitched. She stepped forward, just enough to let the authority behind her words land fully. What you've done here today is not just a misuse of discretion, she said, her tone razor sharp. It is a constitutional violation, and I'll be happy to cite precedent. The judge tried to speak, but Jasmine didn't stop. Church of the Lukumi Babalu Aye City of Hialeah, 508 US 520, she announced, her voice rising just enough to carry. In that ruling, the Supreme Court held that government actions targeting specific religious practices or symbols without legitimate, compelling interest are unconstitutional. Your action, Your Honor, was not neutral. It singled me out while others were allowed to wear expressive clothing and jewelry. This is targeted suppression. There it was, the shift in power. You could feel it. It was like a slow tremor running beneath the courtroom floor. Hargrove's fingers twitched on the gavel, but it never lifted. His face flushed, his nostrils flared, but he said nothing. Jasmine's words had landed like strikes, measured, clean, impossible to refute. Across the courtroom, heads turned again, not toward the bench, but toward her. A woman in the back row mouthed, "She's quoting the Supreme Court." A man near the aisle shook his head in disbelief. "He's done," he whispered. But Jasmine wasn't done. Not yet. The silence was thick enough to choke on. Jasmine's final words still echoed faintly, but the courtroom itself had gone utterly still. Every eye was on her, not with pity, not with confusion, but with stunned recognition. She had just flipped the script, turned the judge's own authority into a spotlight, and now, with surgical precision, she pressed forward. She stood again, slow and deliberate, and let her eyes move across the room like a prosecutor about to deliver closing arguments. "Let's talk about what's really happening here," she said, voice cool as glass, slicing through the stillness. "That man over there," she pointed calmly to the one in the stained, slogan-plastered t-shirt that read, "I am the law" in bold mocking letters, was not asked to change his shirt, was not fined, was not even acknowledged. The man looked down at his chest almost sheepishly. "And her," Jasmine continued, now gesturing toward the woman in the glimmering, chandelier-like necklace, still lounging beside her lawyer, "walked into this courtroom wearing enough rhinestones to trigger a security alert, but not a word was said to her either." She paused, not for effect, but for accuracy. She wanted every second to burn into the memory of the people in that room. "I, however," she continued, her voice steady but tightening like a vice, "walked in silently, spoke to no one, broke no rule, and I was fined $500 for wearing a cross, something smaller than a lapel pin, something constitutionally protected, something that didn't violate a single written courtroom guideline." Her words cut cleanly, no shouting, no exaggeration, just the facts, laid bare and undeniable. Hargrove tried to hold her gaze, but his face was losing color by the second. The room watched him, waiting for a rebuttal, a justification, anything, but none came. The flush on his face deepened into something between anger and shame. He opened his mouth once, but no sound came out. His hands hovered near the gavel, trembling faintly. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice. She had already won the room. "There is no posted dress code," she added calmly, "that bans symbols of faith. There is no courtroom policy that demands I strip away my identity to enter this space. But you," she looked at Hargrove now, directly, the air between them electric, "chose to single me out. You chose this cross, this symbol, to make an example of." The words hit like stone, cold, heavy, final. You could almost hear the thoughts forming in the spectators' heads. He wouldn't have done that if it was just a necklace, or a slogan, or a sports jersey. Only the cross drew fire. The clerk stopped typing again, this time intentionally. Her hands had fallen to her lap, and her face was locked in a grimace, like someone watching a train derail in slow motion. The bailiff stood unnaturally still, as if bracing for an explosion that hadn't come yet. No one in the gallery dared to speak, yet their eyes screamed with questions. Why her? Why now? Why the cross? Jasmine's calm demeanor only made the injustice feel sharper. It wasn't a loud rebellion. It was controlled demolition, one quiet truth at a time. Jasmine took one final step toward the bench, not too close, but close enough to assert presence without invading space. This courtroom allowed neon colors, profanity in print, and glitter that can be seen from orbit, she said, her tone still even, almost journalistic. "But what did you see as a threat? A silver cross?" Her fingers brushed it lightly, not for drama, but as a reminder. "You didn't see disruption, you saw devotion, and that, to you, was dangerous." The breath in the room was drawn in unison, as if everyone had been holding it since she first spoke. Hargrove's lips parted again, but his voice betrayed him, raspy, thin, brittle. "You're twisting," he started, but the sentence collapsed under its own weight. There was nothing to twist. She had presented facts. Observable, undeniable, constitutional facts. Jasmine didn't move. She let the silence hang. The judge's power, once absolute, now flickered like a dying light bulb under the scrutiny of truth. His authority had not been taken from him. It had simply evaporated under exposure. Even those who hadn't known who Jasmine Crockett was when she entered the room now understood fully. She wasn't just a woman with a title. She was a weapon honed by experience and fortified by conviction. Her words were not reactive. They were strategic. Every comparison she made, every injustice she pointed out, was documented, calculated, and leveled with precision against the man who thought he could break her with a fine. But it hadn't worked. It had only revealed him. The energy shifted. What had been a courtroom ruled by fear had become a tribunal of witnesses. Witnesses to bias, to double standards, to a moment that would not be forgotten. And Jasmine? She simply stepped back, silent once more, her presence still radiating like a spotlight on the truth no one could deny now. The silence that followed Jasmine's dismantling of Judge Hargrove's authority hung like a noose in the center of the courtroom. Every pair of eyes flicked from her to the bench, waiting, daring to see what the man in black robes would do next. The gavel, once his symbol of dominance, now sat useless beside him, untouched, as if even it refused to be a part of what came next. Hargrove's jaw clenched, his face twitching in tiny involuntary spasms as he scanned the room for some invisible lifeline, some way out of the mess he'd created with his own bias. His voice finally broke the stillness, low, uneven, and far from the confident authority it had once carried. "Miss Crockett," he muttered, clearing his throat, Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. My intent was never to target your faith or your position." The words felt brittle, hollow. No one in the room believed them, least of all Jasmine. She didn't move. She didn't blink. Her silence was louder than any outburst, and it made him stumble further. "I will rescind the fine," Hargrove added quickly, desperation bleeding into his voice. "There's no need for this to escalate. Let's consider it resolved." His fingers twitched toward the gavel again, as if hoping the mere sound of wood striking wood could magically restore order. But this time, Jasmine spoke before he could touch it. Her voice was soft but carried the bite of precision, the chill of complete control. "No, Your Honor," she said clearly, every syllable like a blade sliding into velvet. "I don't want the fine rescinded." A murmur rippled through the courtroom like an aftershock. The clerk's fingers froze again. The bailiff's eyebrows raised, barely perceptible. Even Hargrove blinked, visibly confused. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone unsteady. Jasmine stepped forward with quiet authority, the silver cross on her collar still gleaming like a banner in defiance. "I will pay the fine," she repeated, "in full. Today." As ordered. Another wave of silence spread across the room, but this time it wasn't confusion. It was awe. She was accepting the punishment, not because it was justified, but because it would live. It would go on record. It would not be buried. And then she turned, not to the judge, but to the woman seated beside the bench. "Mrs. Thompson," Jasmine said calmly, addressing the court clerk by name, "please ensure that the reason for the fine is recorded in the official transcript verbatim." The clerk looked up, stunned. Jasmine continued, unwavering. "Document clearly that I was fined for wearing a cross, not for disruption, not for speaking out of turn, not for violating any rule, but for wearing a religious symbol in silence." Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Let the record show that." Gasps became audible now. Someone in the back muttered, "She's branding it in history." A young law student watching from the far corner scribbled furiously in her notebook, jaw clenched, eyes wide. Hargrove looked visibly paler by the second. His robe, once a cloak of absolute power, now looked like a relic of a system exposed. "Miss Crockett," he tried again, softer now, even pleading, "there's no need to formalize this. It was, truly, a misinterpretation on my part. Let's move on." But Jasmine didn't yield. She didn't even look at him when she responded. Her eyes remained on the clerk. Mrs. Thompson, she said again, firmer this time, please confirm that the transcript will reflect the exact cause cited for the contempt charge. The clerk's throat bobbed as she swallowed, then nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, she said, barely above a whisper. It'll be written exactly as stated. Jasmine gave a small, respectful nod, not to the judge, but to the system, to the mechanism that would now bear witness. Then, with the elegance of a final move on a chessboard, she reached into her leather bag, pulled out a checkbook, and began writing. Each stroke of the pen felt like a drumbeat, a declaration of war, not with rage, but with reason. She tore the check free, walked it forward, and placed it on the clerk's desk with a grace that made it look like a ceremonial offering. But everyone in the room knew what it really was, a receipt for injustice paid in full. Not as surrender, but as evidence. This isn't about money, Jasmine said, turning once more to the court, not just the judge, but the entire gallery. It's about accountability. The fine isn't the punishment, it's the proof. Her words hit like hammers, measured, deliberate, and undeniable. I'm not here to erase what happened. I'm here to make sure it cannot be denied. Hargrove sat frozen. The man who minutes ago had barked orders like a general now looked like a relic surrounded by revolution. His lips parted, but no response came. He had no gavel loud enough to drown her out, no legal ground strong enough to stand on, no allies in the room who dared back him now. Jasmine had taken his attempt at humiliation and turned it into a case study, a moment that would be taught, quoted, and replayed far beyond the cracked walls of this courtroom. She returned to her seat slowly, the heels of her shoes clicking with a finality that sounded like closing statements. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The room remained breathless, like a battlefield in the quiet moments after one side realizes it has lost. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to dim, as if exhausted by what they'd witnessed. The court clerk resumed typing, but now each keystroke felt sacred. Witnesses looked down, unsure whether to cheer or stay silent. Jasmine Crockett didn't demand applause. She didn't need it. She had turned a $500 fine into an immortal record, a scar on the system that would not fade. And across the room, Judge Hargrove sat still, suffocating under the weight of a truth he had tried to bury. He hadn't just lost control of his courtroom. He had lost control of the narrative. And Jasmine had taken it, quietly, legally, and irrevocably. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Jasmine Crockett with a hiss of pressure, as though the entire building had exhaled at her departure. She stepped into the fading light of Washington, D.C.'s late afternoon, but the fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. Her heels struck the marble steps with the rhythm of a ticking bomb, her mind racing but focused. She didn't speak. She didn't look back. The check had been submitted, the record had been sealed, and the message had been delivered. Justice wasn't a costume draped in tradition. It was a fight, and she had just turned the system's weapon against itself. Sliding into the back seat of her government-issued black SUV, she pulled out her phone and opened the secure app. One swipe, and the full audio recording of the courtroom exchange uploaded to the White House's encrypted legal server. No edits, no omissions, just raw truth. Next, she drafted the email. Her fingers moved like a pianist playing the last notes of a requiem. Subject line, contempt fine, D.C. courtroom incident, First Amendment violation. She attached the time-stamped audio file, along with a direct quote from the court transcript as entered by Clerk Thompson. Subject fined $500 for wearing a cross. Beneath that, she pasted a short paragraph. Clinical, concise, lethal. Judge Hargrove issued a contempt citation for visible religious expression without citing any court policy. Compared treatment with other courtroom attendees shows selective enforcement. Recommend immediate legal review. She hit send. The email shot directly to the desk of President Trump's senior legal advisor. Within seconds, her phone buzzed with confirmation. But the battlefield was no longer confined to marble walls and oak benches. It had exploded into the ether. Somewhere in the gallery, someone had broken the courtroom's no recording policy and captured a video, blurry but clear enough to catch the moment Jasmine raised her gold-embossed badge. The moment she cited Church of the Lukumi, Babalu I Vers Hialeah, The moment she said, "You didn't see disruption, you saw devotion," and that to you was dangerous. The clip hit social media like a grenade. By the time her SUV turned onto Pennsylvania Avenue, the hashtag was already trending. Crossing court. 2 words, 1 war. Twitter caught fire first. A conservative student in Texas posted the video with the caption, "White House press secretary fined for wearing a cross." She didn't back down. She flipped the courtroom. It was shared 12,000 times in under an hour. A military veteran added, "Fought overseas for freedom of religion? Can't believe it's under attack here. Respect to Jasmine Crockett." The quote was paired with the now iconic screenshot. Jasmine standing at the defendant's podium, cross gleaming, face calm, judge stunned. Facebook followed next, posts flooded by pastors, civil liberty lawyers, and everyday Americans who had once been told to take off that cross or hide that symbol. They saw themselves in Jasmine, and they saw what courage looked like in a courtroom. Then came the headlines. Fox News ran it first, bold and blazing. Judge fines White House press secretary over cross. She shreds him with the Constitution. Within minutes, other conservative outlets piled on. The Daily Wire, Newsmax, OAN. Their tickers rolled the same narrative. First Amendment under fire. Primetime anchors lined up legal experts, constitutional scholars, even former judges, all replaying the same moment. A courtroom where injustice was challenged by a young woman with nothing but her voice, her badge, and her faith. And at 7:13 p.m., the political tsunami struck. Donald J. Trump, 45th President of the United States, posted from his personal account, "My incredible press secretary, Jasmine Crockett, just taught a radical judge a lesson in the Constitution. Faith is not a crime. She paid the fine to prove the point. Legal genius, patriotic warrior, crossing court." The tweet exploded. 20,000 retweets in 10 minutes. Over 100,000 likes by the time Jasmine's SUV pulled up to the White House gates. Cable news shows scrambled to update their programming. Pundits began referring to her not just as press secretary, but defender of the First Amendment. Even normally cautious voices joined in. A former Obama-era legal analyst tweeted, "Rare to see courtroom power flipped in real time. Miss Crockett understood the law better than the judge." Stunning moment. In less than 2 hours, she wasn't just a witness to a First Amendment violation. She was the face of the response. But it wasn't just digital noise. Behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. The White House legal office had received not only Jasmine's email, but 5 forwarded statements from sitting Congress members demanding judicial review. The Office for Civil Rights was pinged. The Department of Justice flagged the courtroom transcript as potential evidence of religious discrimination. Calls poured in from journalists and legal watchdogs. What happened in that courtroom had sparked something that couldn't be ignored, and Jasmine had made sure the proof was on paper, on tape, and on every screen in America. In her West Wing office, Jasmine stood by the window as her phone buzzed endlessly. Texts from colleagues, reporters, strangers. She wasn't smiling. She was focused. She read one message from her father, a retired minister in Georgia. "You stood up for all of us today. I'm proud." Her eyes softened for a moment, but then sharpened again. There was still work to do, still silence to break, still records to preserve. Across the hall, her assistant peeked in. "Fox News wants a statement." CNN too. And the DOJ just asked for the full audio. Jasmine nodded. "Send them everything." Because this wasn't over. This was only the ignition. Judge Charles Hargrove sat behind his desk, but he no longer felt like a judge. The oak-paneled walls of his chambers, once symbols of solemn authority, now felt like a cage. His phone vibrated again, 4th time in 5 minutes. He didn't answer. He couldn't. First call had been from a local journalist, polite but pointed. "Judge Hargrove, would you care to comment on allegations of religious discrimination in your courtroom today?" He'd hung up. The second call came from a national outlet, then another and another. His email inbox was worse. Headlines and subject lines, bolded accusations, requests for comment. And now the most chilling notification yet. The missed call from the D.C. Judicial Conduct Review Board. That wasn't media. That was oversight. That was real. That was power shifting under his feet. He leaned back in his chair, but it didn't help. The leather felt stiff, like it was judging him too. The courtroom transcript lay open on his desk, printed by his clerk, Mrs. Thompson. Highlighted, underlined, damning. Subject fined $500 for wearing a cross. That line glared up at him like a burning brand. He tried to justify it, tried to recall a rule, a policy, something procedural. But nothing came. No clause, no precedent, only his own voice, cold, dismissive, recorded for the world to hear, telling a government official her cross had no place in his courtroom. A courtroom that, just hours ago, he had believed he ruled absolutely. Now that illusion was crumbling. He reached for the remote, turned on the small television mounted on the wall. The news was already running footage. Grainy video of Jasmine Crockett, mid-sentence, holding up her badge, citing Church of Lukumi Babalu Aya versus Hialeah like a veteran litigator. The chyron beneath her read, Judge Finings WH Press Secretary. Then she turns the courtroom against him. Another clip showed her dropping the check onto the clerk's desk like a mic drop carved in stone. Hargrove's hand trembled slightly as he muted the sound. It didn't matter. The damage was spreading without volume, without mercy. Another buzz, another headline. WEH Press Secretary pays fine for cross, demands it be put on record. Judge silent. His silence wasn't just mentioned. It was weaponized, framed as cowardice. His authority, once absolute within those courtroom walls, was now under siege. Not by mob rule, but by reason, by law, by a woman he had underestimated, a woman who understood the system better than he ever thought she would. He turned back to the transcript and read it again. Every word he'd said was there, immortalized. Remove that cross. This isn't a church. Contempt. It was all there, black and white, with the sound of his gavel like a death knell echoing through the lines, and her responses, clear, constitutional, unimpeachable. He suddenly understood why she hadn't fought the fine. She didn't need to win in that courtroom. She had bigger plans. And now every reporter, every senator, every citizen watching the news was starting to realize the same thing. He sank into his chair. The robe around his shoulders no longer felt like power. It felt like weight, like a burden. And he knew without a doubt that this was far from over. The storm Jasmine Crockett had unleashed wasn't just media noise. It was accountability, and it was coming for him. The hallway outside the D.C. Judicial Oversight Committee pulsed with tension. Reporters lined the corridor, cameras humming, microphones pointed at closed doors like weapons waiting to fire. Inside, the lights buzzed faintly over a long, polished table, where Ellen Thompson, court clerk of 12 years, sat upright with the poise of someone who had finally decided to stop being silent. Her eyes didn't blink behind thin glasses. Her fingers rested lightly on a thick, spiral-bound notebook. Its pages yellowed, edges curled with time. This wasn't a diary. It was a ledger of patterns, of bias, of unchecked authority. And today it would speak louder than any gavel. State your name and role for the record, the lead investigator said. Ellen Marie Thompson, she answered without hesitation. Court clerk, assigned to Judge Charles Hargrove's courtroom. 12 years. She opened the notebook, revealing pages filled with meticulous notations, dates, case numbers, descriptions, and brief quotes. She turned to a red-tabbed section. These, she said, are all instances where Judge Hargrove issued fines or contempt citations for religious symbols, crosses, hijabs, even a woman with a Star of David once. In every case, the individual was not disruptive, not in violation of posted rules, but they were fined, reprimanded, silenced. The committee members exchanged glances. One leaned closer. How often did this happen? Thompson didn't blink. Too often to dismiss, not enough to excuse. I documented them because I started to notice a pattern. You want to know what never got punished? Obscene slogans, vulgar t-shirts, jewelry so big it looked like stage props. But if it was tied to faith, she paused, letting the silence do the work. Then it became a problem. Outside the chamber, the press caught wind within minutes. Breaking news alerts flashed across phones. Court clerk testifies, judge targeted Faith symbols for years. But the wave hadn't crested yet, because the next man to walk into that room carried a different kind of power, truth backed by uniform. James Wilson, senior court bailiff, stepped in wearing his regulation blues, every inch of him carved by discipline. But his jaw was tight, and his voice, usually reserved for shouting "all rise," was steady, low, and laced with guilt. "I've served under Judge Hargrove for 15 years, Wilson began, "and what Miss Thompson said is true." The room went still. "I've seen people fined for wearing crosses, for hijabs, for shirts with scripture, no outbursts, no violations, just presence. But the ones with graphic language, with offensive slogans, he ignored them. Every time." The investigator folded her hands. "You're saying Judge Hargrove selectively enforced courtroom decorum?" "I'm saying," Wilson said slowly, "that one morning in April last year, 5 people came in, separately, all wearing crosses. None of them spoke out of turn. All 5 were fined. He called it preventative order. Meanwhile, a guy wearing a shirt that said "Reformage the system" sat in the front row and didn't get so much as a glance. The weight of those words dropped like a cinder block. And then, the name. "It wasn't until Jasmine Crockett stood her ground," Wilson said, "that I realized we had all been complicit. We let it go. We let him get away with it for years." That sentence detonated across every newsroom in D.C. By noon, the Judicial Oversight Committee launched an emergency ethics review. Subpoenas flew, transcripts were pulled. Every ruling from the past 10 years under Hargrove's gavel involving dress code, contempt, or courtroom decorum was flagged. Surveillance footage was requested. Clerks and bailiffs were quietly interviewed, and Hargrove's courtroom was placed under temporary closure. Back inside his now dim office, Charles Hargrove sat frozen. The robe that once symbolized his dominion hung limp behind his chair like a funeral shroud. The once buzzing phone now rang with venom. Calls from former colleagues ignored. Emails from legal defense funds rejected. Even his alma mater issued a statement reaffirming their commitment to religious neutrality. His name wasn't just being criticized, it was being dragged into the center of a constitutional scandal. One by one, the allies evaporated. The Bar Association canceled his speaking engagement. A judicial panel rescinded his invitation to a private conference. Even his closest colleague, Judge Weaver, sent a one-line message: "I suggest you step back before this buries you." But the worst blow wasn't from a peer. It came in the form of a headline: "Systemic Religious Bias, Inside Judge Hargrove's War on Symbols." Beneath it, the opening line read like an obituary: "For years, Judge Charles Hargrove ruled with quiet bias, until one woman, with a cross and a calm voice, brought the system to its knees." He clicked through more stories, eyes wide but blank. Every outlet had turned on him. The conservative media called him a tyrant in robes. Liberal outlets dubbed him the face of hidden courtroom bigotry. The Washington Post ran a full expose titled "Faith in Contempt, the Hidden Record of Charles Hargrove." Every ruling he'd ever made was now suspect. Lawyers began filing motions to vacate judgments. Civil liberties organizations were mobilizing. People he had ruled against, quiet families, soft-spoken immigrants, religious workers, were lining up with lawyers, affidavits in hand. And Hargrove, he couldn't say a word, because 2 of his most loyal officers, Ellen Thompson and James Wilson, had already spoken, and the world believed them. The courtroom was quiet, but the nation was not. In the days following the testimonies, the investigations, and the media firestorm, Judge Charles Hargrove's world had all but collapsed. Every interview he refused only made him look more guilty. Every photo of Jasmine Crockett standing firm with a cross on her collar became a digital dagger twisting in public perception. Protesters had gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Faith is not a crime, and judges don't silence God." Online petitions demanding his removal passed 500,000 signatures in 48 hours. His name, once feared in legal circles, now trended alongside disgrace. And then, Without cameras, without ceremony, Hargrove made the only move left that didn't reek of denial. He resigned. The announcement came via a short statement emailed to the press. Effective immediately, I, Charles Hargrove, resigned from my position as district court judge. I recognize the need to reflect on the consequences of my actions and undergo formal training on First Amendment protections and religious liberties. I intend to learn. I intend to listen. There were no press conferences, no handshakes, just silence. A silence he no longer controlled. But as one gavel fell, another voice rose. Clear, commanding, impossible to ignore. Jasmine Crockett stood at the White House press podium, the late afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows, igniting the golden trim on her navy blazer. Behind her, the American flag stood tall. At her collar, the silver cross gleamed, not as defiance now, but as a symbol reclaimed. The press room was packed, every seat filled, every camera live, every lens fixed on her like a nation watching its own reflection. She looked out, paused, and then spoke with the quiet thunder of truth. I didn't speak out because I was offended, she began. I spoke because I was obligated. Her voice didn't shake, it cut. When I walked into that courtroom wearing a cross, I walked in carrying the silent faith of millions who wear their beliefs daily, on their sleeves, in their hearts, around their necks. And what happened to me was not unique. It was just the first time it was caught, recorded, and broadcasted. Flashes burst from camera shutters, but no one interrupted. The room was locked in her gravity. She continued, the fine I paid was never about money. It was a receipt for injustice. One I chose to keep. One I chose to let the world see. Her tone sharpened, rising just enough to match the weight of her words. I didn't stand that day for myself. I stood for the mother silenced during a custody hearing for wearing a cross, for the Muslim woman who was told her hijab made the jury uncomfortable, for the Sikh man asked to remove his turban at the security checkpoint of a courtroom built to protect liberty. A journalist lowered his pen. Another forgot to breathe. This wasn't a press briefing, it was history. I stood, Jasmine said, because our freedom to believe, openly, without apology, is not negotiable. Not in America, not on my watch. Her words struck like lightning, illuminating every unspoken grievance, every courtroom injustice hidden under procedural jargon. Judge Hargrove resigned, and I respect that decision, but resignation alone is not reform, it is acknowledgement. And now we move forward. Behind the scenes, aides wiped their eyes. In the hallway, even skeptical reporters stood still. The air carried not applause, but reverence. She took one final step forward. This is not about political sides. It is not about winning headlines. This is about reminding every citizen that their faith, their expression, their truth is protected. Not because the court allows it, but because the Constitution guarantees it. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but it echoed like thunder. We are not guests in our democracy. We are the hosts, and justice answers to us. She stepped back, the podium empty again, but her presence still radiant. No more needed to be said. The world had listened, and it would not forget. The ripple effect started slowly. A single photo, a single sentence, shared across a single social media post. But by the time the sun set over Washington, D.C., on the day of Jasmine Crockett's press conference, the momentum had grown into a national wave. The photo that broke the dam was simple. Jasmine standing behind the White House podium, silver cross on her collar glinting in the light, eyes focused, jaw set. It didn't need a caption. It was the caption. That image exploded across every platform: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, even LinkedIn, as Americans from all faiths began posting it with hashtags like Chalk Courage in Court, Chalk Symbol of Strength, and most notably, Chalk Cross in Court. Within 24 hours, it was on the front page of every major paper in the country. The New York Times called her the new face of constitutional courage. Fox News dubbed her a symbol of American resilience. Even The Atlantic ran a headline that read, Faith, Fearlessness, and the Fight for Liberty. But this wasn't just cultural, it turned political. In Texas, Governor Greg Abbott held a press conference flanked by state judges and lawmakers. "We have reviewed the Crockett incident in full," he announced. "And let me be clear, we will not tolerate religious bias in any Texas courtroom." He ordered a statewide audit of court rulings over the past 5 years, specifically targeting fines, warnings, or citations involving religious expression. Within hours, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis echoed the call, signing an executive order to launch an investigative committee into courtroom neutrality. "Freedom of faith doesn't pause at the courtroom door," he declared. Then came Ohio. Governor Mike DeWine introduced emergency legislation mandating transparency in courtroom conduct and requiring mandatory First Amendment training for all court officers, from clerks to judges. "We owe it to the Constitution," DeWine said, "and we owe it to Jasmine Crockett." Committees were formed, panels convened, old transcripts were dug up and pored over by newly hired legal analysts. In dozens of cities, reporters began contacting former courtroom defendants who had once been fined or silenced for wearing symbols of faith. A Muslim woman in Tampa spoke on live television. "They told me to remove my hijab during jury duty. I said no. They told me to leave. I never filed a complaint. But after Jasmine, I will." In Cleveland, a Jewish man recalled being fined $150 for wearing a yarmulke in court. He'd paid it without question. Now he was filing a civil suit. Jasmine had become more than a press secretary. She had become a catalyst. The American Bar Association held an emergency summit, the first of its kind in a decade, to address religious expression and judicial conduct. Civil rights organizations poured funding into legal outreach centers. Churches, mosques, and synagogues hosted legal literacy nights, handing out copies of the First Amendment and printing Jasmine Crockett's speech beneath the preamble of the Constitution. Protesters outside courthouses didn't carry signs with slogans. They carried her image. And always, always that cross. It was in that symbol the country found its clarity. Jasmine Crockett didn't just endure injustice. She exposed it, documented it, and transformed it into fuel. The injustice she faced in a single courtroom had become the matchstick that lit a fire under an entire judicial system. And that image, her face, her stance, her faith, weaponized not in rage but in reason, became the icon of a movement. The Library of Congress archived the image. Time magazine placed it on their cover with a single word: unshaken. Meanwhile, artists painted murals, students wrote essays, and filmmakers pitched documentaries. She had not asked for any of it. She hadn't staged it, but history had chosen her moment and made it unforgettable. In state after state, courtrooms began to shift. Dress codes were rewritten, staff were retrained, judges were warned, and in every discussion, every memo, one name echoed through the chambers of power: Jasmine Crockett. Not because she demanded it, but because she embodied it. A woman who did not walk out of a courtroom in protest, but stood in it, paid the fine, and made sure it was written down. Not for drama, not for politics, for truth. And that, more than any gavel or robe, had shaken the system to its core. The announcement came not with fanfare, but with force. A crisp, white document released by the D.C. Judicial Council was dropped onto every major desk in American law. Its title was blunt: Revised Courtroom Conduct Guidelines, Protection of Religious Expression. Printed in bold on the second page were the words that would change courtrooms across the nation. No individual may be fined, cited, removed, or reprimanded for wearing religious symbols, garments, or insignia, unless such display causes a clear, measurable disruption to proceedings. The impact was seismic. Overnight, judges were called into emergency training sessions. Bailiffs were briefed on neutrality and implicit bias. Clerks were issued laminated summaries of the First Amendment, now required reading in every court from federal benches to municipal halls. The council had made its decision, but everyone knew it wasn't born from policy. It was born from a confrontation, from one moment, from one woman, Jasmine Crockett. Her name was no longer just a name. It had become an invocation, and now that name was being spoken behind closed doors at the highest levels of judicial power. At 7 a.m., Jasmine stood on the Truman balcony of the White House, the sun cresting over Washington like a spotlight trained just for her. She didn't hold a press release. She held a single sheet of paper. The letterhead at the top read, United States National Judicial Reform Commission. It was an invitation. One line stood out among the rest. Ms. Crockett, in light of your unwavering defense of civil liberties and judicial equity, the Council respectfully invites you to chair the newly established National Committee for Courtroom Reform. Her fingers didn't tremble, but her breath caught for a half second. It wasn't power they were offering, it was purpose. And Jasmine had never needed to be asked twice. By noon, the press had it. CNN broadcast the segment live. Jasmine standing at the East Room podium, the silver cross on her collar not just a symbol, but a scar, earned and worn. She looked out across a sea of cameras, her voice low and unhurried. We don't build justice by silencing faith, she began. We build it by acknowledging difference, by protecting it. Her gaze shifted toward the back of the room, where leaders from across the political aisle stood shoulder to shoulder, all summoned by one truth they could no longer ignore. The courtroom, she continued, is not a sanctuary, but it should never become a weapon. The gavel exists to restore order, not to punish belief. Reporters didn't interrupt. They couldn't. Her voice wasn't just measured. It was magnetic. Every sentence landed like a verdict in history. I did not accept this position to be a figurehead. I accepted because we've let too many people suffer silently behind court walls. I've spoken with mothers fined for prayer beads, with teenagers reprimanded for religious pins, with veterans told their faith patches were unprofessional. That ends now. A wave of applause erupted, not from partisans, not from staffers, but from the very people who had once been ignored. And Jasmine, ever composed, nodded once and closed with a line that would echo across courtrooms for generations. Let the law serve all, not just the loudest, not just the robed, but the faithful, the silent, and the unseen. What followed was a cascade. 37 states adopted the Council's new guidelines within the first month. Judicial training centers added modules titled the Crockett Doctrine. Ivy League law schools made her case required study. Court transcripts across the country were audited for violations. And every time a new case emerged, every time a judge hesitated before citing someone for religious expression, there was always one unspoken question hanging in the air. What would Jasmine Crockett do? But Jasmine wasn't just inspiring change, she was commanding it. Weekly meetings with the Justice Department turned into monthly cross-agency reform panels. She traveled to cities and towns where the court system had failed its citizens, flanked not by cameras, but by constitutional experts and civil rights lawyers. And always, she returned to the same point. Faith does not end at the courtroom door. It walks in with you. And from now on, the system will walk with it. The room was silent, not with indifference, but with anticipation. It wasn't a courtroom this time, but a training hall inside the National Judicial Academy. Rows of judges, clerks, bailiffs, and legal scholars sat in metal-backed chairs, not as authorities, but as students. At the front stood a lectern, unremarkable in design but loaded with gravity. Behind it, for the first time in his life, Judge Charles Hargrove looked small, not by stature, but by the weight he now carried, not the robe, not the title, but the consequence of his own unchecked power. He gripped the edges of the lectern with white knuckles. The suit he wore was tailored, but it couldn't cover the exhaustion on his face. His silver hair, once a mark of judicial dignity, now seemed more like ash. A camera in the back recorded, not for broadcast, for archival, for the history books. And Hargrove knew this moment wasn't about redemption. It was about reckoning. He took a slow breath and began. My name, he said, voice low but steady, is Charles Hargrove, former judge of the D.C. local court, and I am here not to speak as someone who upheld the law, but as someone who, at times, distorted it. No one moved. For 12 years, I believed I was defending courtroom decorum, he continued. What I was really doing was enforcing my own bias. I masked discrimination in procedure. I hid personal prejudice behind the word order, and worst of all, I silenced people, quietly, consistently, because their faith made me uncomfortable. The tension in the room thickened. Some attendees looked down. Others stared directly at him, not out of judgment, but out of demand. He had asked to speak. Now they were listening. I fined people for wearing crosses, for wearing hijabs. I scolded a man once for kissing a rosary. I claimed neutrality but practiced intolerance, and for years no one stopped me, because no one dared. He paused. Until Jasmine Crockett. A flicker moved through the audience. The name now held weight like a constitutional amendment. Hargrove didn't flinch. She stood in my courtroom, he said, his voice beginning to crack. Not yelling, not accusing, just standing, with clarity, with law, and with faith. And I tried to make her small. He gripped the lectern tighter. I fined her, not because she broke the rules, but because she broke me. She challenged the part of me I didn't want to face, the part that still believed authority was above accountability. The silence was now oppressive, and yet necessary. I've spent months reviewing my own cases. I've read every complaint, every transcript. I've watched the footage, and I've seen myself, not as I thought I was, but as I truly appeared, rigid, fearful, and biased. He swallowed hard. I cannot erase what I did, but I can name it. I can confront it, and I can ensure that others, judges like me, see the damage before they repeat it. In the back row, a young clerk who had once been reprimanded for wearing a Star of David to court clenched her jaw. She wasn't angry. She was listening closely. I joined this training, Hargrove said, not because I was forced to, but because I must. Because the law isn't static. It grows. And I must grow with it, or leave it behind. He lifted his eyes to the room. Those I hurt, I'm sorry, truly. I'm sorry for the humiliation, for the silence, for the injustice carried under the pretense of professionalism. I do not ask for forgiveness. I ask for awareness, for all of us. He exhaled, slow, long, waited. I was once the man who punished a cross. Today, I sit beneath it. No one clapped. No one cheered. The moment wasn't built for that. Instead, a different kind of silence filled the air, one thick with reflection, discomfort, and perhaps the faintest seed of change, because even the most stubborn trees can crack open if the light is strong enough. And in that moment, the light didn't come from Hargrove. It came from the absence of his power and the presence of his truth. In a world where silence often masks injustice, and institutions cloak discrimination in the language of order, one woman stood in a courtroom, not to speak louder, but to stand firmer. Jasmine Crockett didn't scream. She didn't storm out. She didn't crumble. She simply wore her faith, stated her right, and refused to be erased. Her punishment wasn't for disruption. It was for existing without apology. In that single moment, the weight of a gavel tried to crush not her voice, but what she represented: belief, dignity, in the quiet power of presence. And yet, through all the bias, the humiliation, the fine meant to reduce her, Jasmine chose not revenge, but reason. She documented her injustice, paid for it with grace, and turned it into fire. Fire that lit up an entire system. Fire that refused to be extinguished by power, robe, or rank. But this story wasn't just about her. It was about all the unseen figures who sat in courtrooms across the country, made to feel small for how they prayed, what they wore, or what they believed. It was about the mother fined for clutching prayer beads, the student silenced for quoting scripture in a testimony, the immigrant asked to remove a turban for the sake of uniformity. Jasmine's case wasn't unique. It was merely unignorable. Her choice to face injustice head-on gave permission to millions to confront their own. She became the voice for those who had none. Courtroom where she was punished became the battleground where silence was shattered. The lesson? Justice without compassion is tyranny in disguise. Procedure without humanity becomes a weapon. And neutrality, when used to suppress belief, is not neutral at all. Jasmine Crockett reminded us that the First Amendment is not just ink on paper. It is a sword for the quiet, a shield for the faithful, and a promise that no gavel can erase. Her defiance wasn't loud, but it echoed across America. Her strength wasn't dramatic, but it shifted the system. And in doing so, She proved that the most powerful revolutions are not born in riots or rulings, but in a woman standing still, wearing a cross, and daring the world to look away. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.